a chilling secret lurks behind Room 17's locked door. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Drop a comment. Where are you joining from tonight? Your thoughts truly brighten this mystery. Now let's dive in. Flaxborough was a town that measured its importance in inches of rainfall and the exact hue of its begonias, the sort of place where the local flower show was both the social event of the season and the battleground of long-standing grudges thinly disguised behind polite smiles and clinking teacups. That year, the annual floral fete was held in the old town hall, a modest brick building with peeling paint and a draught that whispered of past decades' secrets. The main hall was transformed into a riot of colour, chrysanthemums of unsettling brightness, begonias arranged with mathematical precision, and roses so perfectly cultivated they seemed to sneer at the amateur gardeners lining the benches. Inspector Purbright stood near the refreshment stall, an unremarkable figure in a tweed jacket and crumpled tie, his gaze casually sweeping the room. His particular interest lay less in the flowers than in the anxious, fluttering faces of the townsfolk. The Murphys, whose petunias had been demoted from first to third place last year. The Whitmores, still nursing old wounds from the disputed rose competition in '72. And the new vicar, Reverend Kershaw, whose dour expression did little to quell rumours of ecclesiastical ambition. As Purbright observed, a mild commotion drew his attention. Near Room 17, a small side chamber used for judging the amateur arrangements, a crowd had gathered. Voices murmured with an odd mixture of curiosity and unease. "Did you see that?" Mrs. Penfold whispered to her neighbour, clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline. Mr. Wilkes, the schoolmaster, was in there all morning. And now, well, I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Mr. Wilkes was indeed at the centre of the small crowd's concern. The mild-mannered schoolmaster had vanished into Room 17 shortly after the judges began their rounds, and only emerged to hastily lock the door behind him, looking unusually pale. Not long after, faint but unmistakable chanting drifted through the walls, a curious rhythmic murmur that unsettled even the more stoic visitors. The vicar, Reverend Kershaw, was the first to break the polite silence. "Such behaviour," he said, voice low but carrying, "is hardly fitting for this place of community gathering. One might almost think we've stumbled upon some sort of ritual." A few uneasy chuckles followed, but the unease lingered. Purbright, ever patient, made his way toward the side door. The scent of damp wood mingled with faint whiffs of gardenia and something less definable, an undercurrent of something unsettling, though he could not yet name it. "Mr. Wilkes," Purbright called softly, as he rapped gently on the door. There was no answer. Turning the handle, he found it locked, the key absent. Nearby, a young woman with keen eyes, Miss Langley, the florist's assistant, caught his glance. "Did you see who left?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, sir, but the chanting, it wasn't like anything I've heard before. Like a prayer or a spell, maybe?" Purbright smiled faintly, a trace of irony in his eyes. In Flaxborough, even the simplest gathering could unfurl into a mystery, and the town's peculiar penchant for keeping secrets ensured that nothing was quite as straightforward as it seemed. As the flower show buzzed on, the closed door of Room 17 stood silent, a quiet sentinel to whatever strange ritual had just taken place. The ceremony was unremarkable in outward appearance, yet its suddenness and secrecy whispered of something more. And for Inspector Purbright, whose art was not in the dramatic but the quietly insightful, the ritual in Room 17 was the opening stanza of a story that Flaxborough would soon murmur about in hushed tones over teacups and tidy garden fences. The floral fete continued with an unsteady hum, as if the very air had been thickened by the strange murmurs from room 17. Outside, a gentle English drizzle began, blurring the edges of the market town's red brick roofs and lending the streets a softened, almost conspiratorial hush. Within the town hall, the scent of damp coats mingled with that of fresh blossoms, while the whispers of curiosity grew steadily louder. Inspector Purbright remained near the entrance to room 17, his keen eyes noting the shift in expression on the faces passing by. There was confusion, certainly, but beneath it something subtler, a ripple of unease, barely concealed beneath practiced politeness. Mrs. Penfold clasped her gloves a little tighter. Mr. Murdoch, the florist, glanced repeatedly toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The flower show's order, so carefully cultivated like the blooms themselves, seemed momentarily unsettled. Purbright's own attention was drawn to the vicar, Reverend Kershaw, who was engaged in low-voiced conversation with Mrs. Whitmore, one of the town council's more formidable members. The vicar's expression was pinched with disapproval, but Mrs. Whitmore's eyes gleamed with something less ecclesiastical, perhaps curiosity, perhaps calculation. "Quite irregular, wouldn't you say?" Kershaw murmured, nodding toward the sealed door. "I cannot imagine what Mr. Wilkes could be doing in there that warrants such secrecy." Mrs. Whitmore tapped her finger against her chin. "Indeed, though I dare say the schoolmaster's reputation is not without its peculiarities. It wouldn't surprise me if he were engaged in something unorthodox." Purbright caught the last phrase and moved closer with a quiet step, his manner deliberately casual. "Good afternoon, Reverend. Mrs. Whitmore?" He inclined his head slightly, and their eyes met. "If I might intrude, might I ask what you were discussing?" Kershaw glanced at Mrs. Whitmore, who offered a tight-lipped smile before replying, "Just speculating, Inspector." One must wonder whether Mr. Wilkes has been practicing some form of private devotion, perhaps a new-fangled interpretation of faith that the town is yet to understand. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. Faith or folly, sometimes difficult to tell in Flaxborough. His tone was dry, but not unkind. "Has anyone seen Mr. Wilkes since this morning?" "Only that he disappeared into room 17 shortly after the show began," Mrs. Whitmore said crisply. "And that door has remained locked since." "Is there no key-holder for that room? A caretaker, perhaps?" Purbright inquired. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "The hall is old and poorly managed. Often the caretaking falls to whoever is available. No formal key register, I'm afraid." Purbright filed this away. The lack of oversight would explain the door's security, but did little to clarify why Mr. Wilkes had taken such pains to seal himself in. "Thank you both," Purbright said, his voice softening as he stepped back. "I think I shall have to have a word with Mr. Wilkes myself." He turned and made his way toward the front desk, where the hall's custodian, a thin man named Mr. Hargreaves, was busy stacking empty teacups with meticulous care. Hargreaves looked up, startled. "Inspector," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm afraid I don't know where Mr. Wilkes is. He came in early and didn't come out until just now. Well, until locking himself in room 17. I tried the door, but it's bolted tight." Purbright nodded. "Is there any way to get the key?" Mr. Hargreaves shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have it, and I'm not sure Mr. Wilkes gave it to anyone else. He can be rather secretive, you see." The inspector's gaze drifted to the cluster of visitors lingering near the hall's entrance, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. "Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves. I'll see what I can do." Stepping away, Purbright was caught by a voice from behind. "Inspector, perhaps I can assist?" It was Miss Langley, the florist's assistant, her expression earnest beneath a mop of untidy chestnut hair. "I thought you might want to hear this." She leaned in. "Some of the local schoolchildren have been talking. They say Mr. Wilkes has been acting strangely lately. Not just odd, but secretive, even a little fearful." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fearful? That's unusual for the schoolmaster." Miss Langley nodded. "They say he's been seen meeting with a few rather unsavoury types, people who don't usually come to the flower show or set foot in the town hall." The inspector's mind quietly catalogued the detail. It was a small thread, but often the smallest threads unravel the tightest knots. As the afternoon wore on, the flower show's usual charm dimmed under the weight of whispered conjecture. The judges continued their rounds, but with less enthusiasm, as if each bloom's perfection was now overshadowed by the mystery behind the locked door. Later, Purbright made his way to the town's modest police station, a converted Victorian house with peeling cream paint and an ever-present smell of stale tobacco. Inside, Sergeant Carrow was busy at his desk, poring over a ledger of minor offences, mostly complaints about missing cats and disputes over boundary hedges. "Evening, Carrow," Purbright greeted. "Evening, sir. Heard about the flower show," Carrow said, glancing up. "Strange business with the schoolmaster, isn't it? Some folks reckon it's a bit of devilry." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. "In Flaxborough, the devil is often disguised as a gentlewoman in a garden hat." Carrow chuckled. "So what's the plan?" "For now, to find Mr. Wilkes and discover what business kept him locked away in room 17, Purbright said. "If he's hiding something, we'll uncover it quietly." The inspector's thoughts drifted to the vicar's mention of ritual, to the faint chanting heard through the door. Was it truly some form of religious exercise or something else cloaked in pious language? The townsfolk's tendency to gossip meant the story would evolve rapidly, each retelling layering suspicion and speculation. Returning to the hall, Purbright observed the gathering crowd around room 17 once more. The door remained locked, but a subtle shift had occurred. The sharp edges of curiosity were softening into apprehension. "Inspector," said a voice from behind. It was Mr. Wilkes's neighbour, Mr. Grayson, a retired bank clerk with a habit of speaking in clipped, measured sentences. "I must say I found the schoolmaster's behaviour most out of character. Usually a quiet, unassuming man, but recently, well, he's been distant, avoiding conversation. Even last week he was seen arguing quietly with the vicar." Purbright inclined his head. "Arguing with Reverend Kershaw? And that's an interesting development." Grayson nodded. "I didn't hear what was said, but the vicar looked rather stern when he left." The inspector thanked him and made a mental note to speak with the vicar again. There was an undercurrent here, a tension beneath the town's polite veneer that suggested motives beyond mere eccentricity. By early evening the flower show was winding down. The award ceremony proceeded with its usual ceremoniousness, though the enthusiasm was tempered, the usual jokes replaced by guarded glances toward room 17. At last, as the crowd dispersed, Purbright was approached by the vicar himself. "Inspector, a word if I may," Reverend Kershaw said, his tone serious. "Of course, Reverend." Kershaw glanced around, lowering his voice. "I must confess I have had my own misgivings about Mr. Wilkes. There have been rumours, whispers that he has dabbled in unorthodox practices, that he's sought to bring certain ancient rites back into the community." Purbright arched an eyebrow. "Ancient rites?" The vicar nodded solemnly. "Yes. I believe Mr. Wilkes has been attempting some form of ceremony, an invocation perhaps. I only discovered this recently, but the chanting you heard, it was part of this ritual." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "And do you think this is cause for alarm?" Kershaw's lips pressed into a thin line. I fear so. Flaxborough is a town steeped in tradition. Disruptions of this nature threaten our very fabric. Purbright nodded slowly. Thank you for your candour, Reverend. I shall look into it. As the evening shadows lengthened, the inspector stood once more before the locked door of room 17. The ritual inside had clearly unsettled the town, but the reasons why remained elusive. What began as a quiet flower show had turned into a puzzle woven with threads of secrecy, fear, and ancient superstition. And at the heart of it, as always, was a man whose motives were as opaque as the mist rolling over Flaxborough's narrow lanes. Purbright lit a cigarette, the faint glow catching the reflection of the now darkened windows, and pondered the first moves of a game that would demand patience, subtlety, and an understanding of human nature's quieter complexities. The ritual had begun. The morning after the flower show arrived with the same mild drizzle that had settled over Flaxborough the night before. The streets, slick with rain, reflected the muted light of a pale sun that struggled through low clouds. It was a day made for careful walking and hushed conversations behind lace curtains. Inspector Purbright arrived at the modest schoolhouse shortly after 8, the place where Mr. Wilkes taught Latin and a smattering of classical literature to a clutch of diligent, if somewhat distracted, local children. The building itself was a humble Victorian relic, red brick softened by ivy, windows fogged with condensation, and a small brass bell that tinkled oddly when rung. Purbright's entrance was met with the curious eyes of Miss Baxter, the head-mistress, a woman of formidable composure and sharp tongue, whose loyalty to order was matched only by her disdain for frivolity. "Inspector," she said briskly, brushing a stray strand of silver hair behind one ear. "To what do we owe this early visit?" "I trust it concerns Mr. Wilkes?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, adopting his usual tone of polite inquiry. "I'm here to understand better his recent activities and whether you might have noticed anything unusual." Miss Baxter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Unusual? Mr. Wilkes has always been a private man, but he is dedicated to his work. That said, there have been whispered concerns among some staff about his extracurricular interests." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Extracurricular? Could you elaborate?" "Well, I won't speculate beyond what's proper, but I can say that Mr. Wilkes has been seen consulting certain books of a rather arcane nature, far removed from the curriculum. Some of us find it unsettling." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Books of an arcane nature?" "Yes, old tomes on ritual and symbolism mostly. It seems he's taken an interest in antiquarian studies beyond what one might expect." The headmistress glanced toward the classroom door, where a few children had gathered, whispering and casting sidelong glances. "Have the pupils noticed anything unusual about him?" Purbright asked. Miss Baxter hesitated. Not directly, but a few have remarked on his distracted manner and, on occasion, his absent-minded muttering. "Thank you, Miss Baxter. I may wish to speak with some of the pupils later." Outside, Purbright's path took him toward the school's small garden, where a group of children played under the watchful eye of Mrs. Crispin, the assistant teacher. The inspector approached with measured steps. "Good morning," he said gently. "Might I have a word with a few of you?" The children looked up, some wide-eyed, others cautious. A boy named Timothy, perhaps 10 years old, stepped forward. "Are you going to ask about Mr. Wilkes?" he said shyly. Purbright smiled. "Yes, Timothy, I'm interested in what you and your classmates might have noticed." Timothy exchanged looks with a girl named Eliza. "Well, he's been different lately. Sometimes he talks to himself, and last week we saw him meet a man near the old mill. The man looked strange." "Strange how?" Purbright probed. Eliza shrugged. He wore a long coat and had a scar on his cheek. He didn't smile. "That's quite specific," the inspector said thoughtfully. "Do you know who the man was?" "No," Timothy replied, "but they whispered a lot." "Thank you both. That's very helpful." Leaving the garden, Purbright considered this new information. The mention of a scarred man meeting with Wilkes near the old mill, a place now largely deserted, added a layer of intrigue. It was a detail easily overlooked, but in Flaxborough, such details often unravelled the town's carefully woven social fabric. Later that morning, Purbright returned to the town hall, where the flower show's aftermath still lingered. The locked door of room 17 remained closed, its mystery growing heavier with each passing hour. He was met by Miss Langley once again, who was arranging a bouquet of late blooms at the refreshment stall. "Inspector," she said softly, "I thought you might want to know. There's talk among the florists that Mr. Wilkes's interests may extend beyond ritual." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Some say he's been investigating the town's history. Old family secrets, strange customs long forgotten. The kind of things people prefer to keep buried." Purbright nodded slowly. "Secrets are the currency of Flaxborough, Miss Langley." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden call from Mr. Hargreaves, the custodian. "Inspector, you'll want to see this." They followed him down the hall to room 17, where the door had been forcibly unlocked. The lock was damaged, splinters of wood scattered across the floor. Inside, the small room was in disarray. A table stood in the centre, its surface marked with candle wax and faint scorch marks. Scattered about were various objects. A leather-bound book open to pages filled with strange symbols, a bundle of dried herbs, and a collection of odd trinkets, feathers, stones, and what looked suspiciously like a carved bone. Purbright picked up the book carefully, noting the handwritten annotations in the margins. The text was an eclectic mix of Latin and archaic English, describing rituals of invocation and protection. It was clear Mr. Wilkes had been deeply engrossed in these matters. "Curious," Purbright murmured. "It seems our schoolmaster's ritual was not merely a private affair, but part of a larger interest in the occult." "Occult?" Miss Langley whispered, glancing nervously around. "Not quite as sinister as it sounds," Purbright assured her. "More an antiquarian fascination, perhaps." He turned to the scorched marks on the table and the remnants of candles. A ceremony of some sort, certainly. But whether it was meant to harm or heal remains to be seen. As they examined the room, Sergeant Carrow arrived, his expression grave. "Inspector, there's been a report," he said quietly. "A disturbance near the old mill last night. Neighbours heard voices raised and the sound of breaking glass." Purbright's eyes sharpened. "That's the place the children mentioned. We must investigate at once." The rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and reflective. At the mill, the inspector found a small crowd gathered, faces pale in the dim light. A broken window revealed the interior, scattered debris, a toppled chair, and footprints muddied by rain. Among the onlookers was Mr. Grayson, who pointed toward the scene. "I found this when I took my morning walk. It seems someone forced their way inside." Purbright surveyed the scene thoughtfully. "Has anyone seen who was responsible?" "No, sir. Just heard the noise." As the crowd dispersed, Purbright lingered, piecing together the threads. Wilkes's secret rituals, meetings with a scarred stranger, the break-in at the mill. The town's veneer of civility was cracking, revealing a web of secrets and tensions beneath. Returning to the station, the inspector prepared to deepen his inquiries. The puzzle was taking shape, each piece more intricate than the last. His approach remained steady, patient observation, careful listening, and a quiet determination to see beyond appearances. In Flaxborough, the ritual in Room 17 was no longer a curious anomaly, but the opening act in a drama of human frailty and hidden motives, and at its centre stood a schoolmaster whose private devotions had begun to unravel the town's delicate peace. The early afternoon in Flaxborough unfolded with a curious blend of routine and quiet tension. Shops along the high street displayed their usual assortment of goods behind polished windows, while townsfolk exchanged greetings with the measured warmth befitting a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wished to or not. Yet beneath this familiar surface, a subtle restlessness had begun to permeate the air, a ripple of uncertainty stirred by the recent disturbances. Inspector Purbright, leaving behind the disarray of Room 17 and the broken window at the mill, decided to pursue a course that might shed more light on Mr. Wilkes's activities. There was an unspoken understanding in his method. While evidence might be found in books or rooms, the true pulse of Flaxborough beat strongest in its conversations, those hushed exchanges, the pauses between words, the polite smiles masking sharper truths. His first visit was to Reverend Kershaw's rectory, a tidy brick house with neat gardens and the faint scent of lavender drifting through open windows. The vicar greeted Purbright with a courteous nod, but no invitation inside. "Inspector," Kershaw began, "I trust you are making progress regarding Mr. Wilkes." "Some progress, Reverend," Purbright replied mildly. "I wonder if you might clarify one point. You mentioned ancient rites. Do you have knowledge of which traditions Mr. Wilkes might have been attempting to revive?" The vicar's gaze flickered briefly to the well-tended garden. "There are local legends, folklore passed down about old protective ceremonies and invocations. Mr. Wilkes's interest appeared to lean towards a form of ritual intended to safeguard the town, though the particulars were vague." Purbright allowed a moment's pause before continuing. "Vague enough that it could be misinterpreted?" Kershaw's thin lips pressed together. "Indeed, to some, any deviation from orthodox practice is suspect, and Mr. Wilkes's behaviour has unsettled more than a few." The inspector nodded, sensing that the vicar's concern was less about theology than about social order. "Thank you, Reverend. Your candour is appreciated." From the rectory, Purbright took a deliberate stroll toward the old mill road, the narrow lane that led to the ruined mill. The afternoon sky had lightened, casting a diffuse glow over the damp cobblestones. Along the way, he passed Mrs. Penfold, who was walking her terrier, Winston, and exchanged a brief greeting. "Inspector," she said, her voice lowering conspiratorially, "I've heard whispers. Some say Mr. Wilkes has enemies among the town council. Old grudges, perhaps." Purbright's expression remained neutral. "Enemies, you say?" "Oh, yes. Mr. Wilkes's reluctance to join certain committees and his outspoken criticisms have not endeared him to everyone." This was the sort of political undercurrent Purbright expected. Flaxborough's small-town rivalries often disguise themselves as civic duty and community spirit, but beneath lay simmering resentments. At the mill, Purbright found the scene quieter than earlier, with only the faintest traces of disruption remaining. The broken window had been boarded up, though the rain had soaked the wooden planks. Nearby, he spotted Mr. Grayson once more, examining the boarded window with a furrowed brow. "Any new observations, Mr. Grayson?" Purbright inquired. The retired bank clerk adjusted his spectacles. "Only that the place seems to attract trouble. I believe there's been other strange comings and goings after dark." "Can you be more specific?" "Well, shadows slipping about, voices whispered in the night. Most respectable folk keep clear, but the mill's isolation lends itself to secrets." Purbright thanked him and turned his steps toward the town's library, a modest building with tall windows and shelves laden with local history. Here he hoped to uncover more about the law that had intrigued Mr. Wilkes. Inside, the librarian, Miss Harcourt, was busy cataloguing new arrivals. She greeted Purbright with a polite smile and readily assisted him in locating texts on Flaxborough's history, folklore, and ritual traditions. As they sifted through the dusty volumes, Purbright's attention was caught by a manuscript detailing the old customs of Flaxborough, including references to seasonal ceremonies held in the town's early days. These involved processions, offerings, and prayers intended to protect against misfortune, remnants of pre-Christian beliefs that lingered in the collective memory. Miss Harcourt remarked, "Many of these customs faded long ago, but some families cling to them in private. There are rumors of a secret society dedicated to preserving these traditions." Purbright's mind connected this to the trinkets found in room 17, feathers, stones, dried herbs, tokens consistent with folk rites rather than scholarly exercises. "Do you know if Mr. Wilkes had any involvement with such groups?" he asked. The librarian shook her head. "Not officially, but he was known to be curious about local history. He often borrowed rare books." Leaving the library, Purbright reflected on the layers of secrecy, scholarly interest, local law, veiled resentments, and perhaps even clandestine gatherings. Later that day, he arranged to meet with Mr. Wilkes's next-door neighbour, Mrs. Henshaw, a widow with a keen eye and an even keener sense of discretion. Her small sitting room was furnished with lace curtains and a large porcelain cat that seemed perpetually amused. Mrs. Henshaw welcomed Purbright with a faint smile, but no invitation to stay longer than necessary. "I've known Mr. Wilkes for years," she began. "Quiet man, but lately different. I heard raised voices between him and the vicar some evenings back. They argued about something. I couldn't catch all the words, but it was serious." Purbright nodded. "Did the argument concern the flower show or his rituals?" Mrs. Henshaw considered. "I suspect it was more than that. Something to do with the town's traditions. The vicar fears the old ways, and Wilkes seems intent on preserving them. And the scarred man the children mentioned. Do you know anything about him?" She hesitated. "Only that he's been seen lurking near the mill, a shadowy figure, not from Flaxborough. Folks say he's connected to some ancient practice, but that's just gossip." Purbright filed this away. The scarred man remained an enigma, a cipher in the unfolding tale. As evening approached, Purbright returned to the police station, where Sergeant Carow awaited with news. "Inspector, there's been a further development," Carow said. "A letter was found tucked behind a loose brick in the mill's outer wall." Purbright's interest piqued. Carow handed over a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile. The letter was penned in a neat but aged hand. "To those who guard Flaxborough's secrets, beware the eyes that pry, the tongues that wag. The ritual must remain sacred, lest chaos return. Trust not the outsider, nor the broken man's scar." A keeper of the old ways, Purbright read the note twice, the words settling heavily in his mind. The reference to keepers, rituals, and outsiders hinted at a group determined to protect something beyond mere superstition. "This complicates matters," Purbright murmured. "We are dealing not simply with an eccentric schoolmaster, but with a faction invested in preserving Flaxborough's ancient rites." Carow frowned. "Do you think Mr. Wilkes is one of these keepers?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, "or at least someone drawn into their fold, but what their ultimate purpose is remains to be seen." That night, as the town settled under a cloak of mist, Purbright sat at his desk, the letter and the ritual book laid out before him. The puzzle pieces formed a shadowy mosaic, old customs clashing with new order, secrets guarded jealously, and a town reluctant to admit its own complexities. Yet beneath it all was a human story of belief, fear, and the need to belong. Purbright's cigarette glowed softly in the gloom, his thoughts turning toward the next move. The ritual in room 17 had opened a door, and beyond it lay a path winding through Flaxborough's hidden history and the quiet tensions of its people. Tomorrow would bring more questions, and he hoped some answers. The morning dawned grey and still, a dampness hanging in the air that seemed to seep into the very bones of Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright arrived early at the town hall, intent on a quiet yet thorough examination of the space where the ritual had taken place. The events so far had woven a tapestry of oddities, secretive meetings, cryptic letters, whispered histories, and Purbright knew well that unravelling it required patience, observation, and a deft touch. Room 17, once a modest chamber reserved for amateur flower judges, now carried a weight of significance far beyond its size. The table with its candle wax scars and scattered trinkets remained, each object a potential clue to the unfolding mystery. Purbright ran his fingers gently along the pages of the ritual book, tracing the faded Latin phrases and enigmatic symbols. The writing was meticulous but jittery, as if penned under pressure. As he examined the room, a sudden knock interrupted his concentration. "Inspector," came Miss Langley's voice from the doorway. "I thought you might want to know there's been a new development." Purbright looked up to see her flushed face and restless eyes. "Do tell." "It's Mr. Wilkes. He's been spotted at the old quarry late last night. Some of the night watchmen saw him there, speaking to that scarred man you've heard about." Purbright arched an eyebrow. The scarred man, the mystery figure who had slipped into the narrative like a shadow. "The quarry, you say?" "That's a place rarely visited except by those with something to hide." Miss Langley nodded. "Exactly. And the quarry is just outside the town's bounds, an old, disused pit with steep sides and tangled undergrowth, not the sort of place for an afternoon stroll." Purbright's mind mapped the new information against what he already knew. The scarred man remained elusive. No records, no formal identity, only vague sightings, and now a secret meeting at a forsaken spot. "Thank you, Miss Langley. I'll pay a visit to the quarry shortly." Before she left, Purbright's attention caught a whisper of conversation nearby. Mrs. Penfold and Mr. Murdoch were engaged in a quiet exchange, their voices laced with barely concealed curiosity. "Did you hear about the night meeting?" Mrs. Penfold whispered, clutching her handbag. "Indeed. If Wilkes is consorting with such company, the town may well be in for a surprise," Mr. Murdoch replied, his florist's hands twitching as if to rearrange an unseen bouquet of suspicion. The inspector merely smiled inwardly. Flaxborough thrived on rumours, and the flower show was but the latest stage for its enduring dramas. By mid-morning, Purbright found himself at the quarry's entrance, a desolate, overgrown scar in the landscape. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of damp earth and forgotten stone. He tread carefully down the narrow path to the pit's base, where remnants of machinery rusted beneath tangled brambles. The place seemed suspended in time, untouched except for the occasional footfall. At the far edge, he spotted a solitary figure, Mr. Wilkes, pacing with restless energy. Beside him stood the scarred man, whose face was partially hidden beneath a weather-beaten cap. Purbright observed quietly from behind a cluster of gorse bushes. The two men's voices were low but urgent, words indistinct yet heavy with meaning. After several minutes, Purbright approached deliberately, his presence announced by a clearing of the throat. "Mr. Wilkes," he said softly, stepping into view. And you must be the gentleman with the scar." Both men turned sharply. The scarred man's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Inspector Purbright," Wilkes greeted with a measured nod. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before the shadows brought you here." Purbright returned the nod, his gaze steady. "Indeed. It seems you have much to explain." The scarred man remained silent, watching with cautious interest. Wilkes sighed and gestured toward a worn leather satchel resting on a nearby stone. "These are the writings I've been studying," he said, lifting a bundle of papers. "Old rituals, yes, but also warnings. Flaxborough's past is tangled with secrets darker than the flower show could ever reveal." Purbright gestured toward the man with the scar. "And your role in this?" Wilkes glanced at him. "A guardian of sorts, someone who understands what these rituals mean and the dangers they guard against." The scarred man finally spoke, his voice rough but deliberate. "We protect the balance. The town's history is not just stories, it's a pact. Disturb it, and consequences follow." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "What consequences?" The man's gaze hardened. "Disorder, misfortune, the return of old forces best left undisturbed." Wilkes added, "Some in Flaxborough wish to forget, to dismiss these traditions as quaint nonsense, but the past has a way of asserting itself." The inspector considered the weight of their words. Here was a conspiracy not of criminals, but of custodians, guardians wielding knowledge that few understood. "Has this pact been broken?" Purbright asked. Wilkes nodded slowly. "Something stirred at the flower show. The ritual was meant to reinforce the boundaries, but with outsiders probing and town council pressures mounting, the delicate equilibrium has been threatened." Purbright absorbed this, the puzzle gaining new dimensions. It was no longer a simple matter of secret rituals or eccentric schoolmasters. The entire town's sense of identity and safety was at stake. "Then your meetings, your ceremonies," he said, "are attempts to preserve that balance." "Precisely," Wilkes affirmed, "but not everyone agrees on how to do so. There are factions, disagreements, even betrayals." The scarred man's eyes flashed with something darker. "Trust is a rare commodity." Purbright let the silence linger, then spoke carefully. "I understand the need for discretion, but the people of Flaxborough deserve to know what's at stake. Secrets can protect, but they can also poison." Wilkes looked away briefly before nodding. "You're right, Inspector. Perhaps it is time to bring some truths into the light." As Purbright left the quarry, the afternoon sun breaking through the cloud cover, he felt the familiar stir of a case growing more complex. Beneath the surface of quaint English village life lay currents of belief and fear, loyalty and suspicion. The ritual in room 17 was only the beginning. Back in town, Purbright found the council chamber abuzz with hushed discussions. Mrs. Whitmore was presiding over a meeting of the town council, her expression stern as she addressed concerns raised by the recent events. The inspector slipped inside quietly, listening as voices debated the propriety of Mr. Wilkes's actions and the possible impact on Flaxborough's reputation. "I propose," Mrs. Whitmore declared, "that we call for a formal inquiry into these occult practices. They threaten our community's standing and must be addressed." A murmur of assent swept through the room, but Purbright caught the glint of unease in several faces. The council was a theatre of appearances, and beneath the polished surface lurked old alliances and rivalries. When the meeting adjourned, Purbright approached Mrs. Whitmore. "Madam, such inquiries can inflame rather than resolve," he said quietly. "Might discretion serve better at this juncture?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile was thin and practiced. "Inspector, the town deserves to know the truth. We cannot allow shadows to dictate our affairs." Purbright inclined his head, recognizing the firmness of her stance, but also the political undertones. "Very well," he said, "but may I suggest that truth requires patience and nuance." As evening settled, the town's lights flickered on one by one, and Flaxborough returned to its rhythms, though beneath the surface the tension remained palpable. Purbright sat at his desk once more, reviewing his notes. The story was no longer about a simple ritual, but a complex web of tradition, secrecy, and power. The scarred man and Mr. Wilkes were but two figures in a broader drama, playing out beneath the town's polite facades. He lit a cigarette and leaned back, readying himself for the days ahead. The ritual in room 17 had opened a door, but what lay beyond was still shrouded in mystery. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the cobblestones of Flaxborough's High Street, as if the town itself hesitated to shed the shadows cast by recent events. The flower show had receded into memory, but the uneasy quiet it left behind persisted. The townsfolk busied themselves with daily chores, yet the familiar rhythms were tinged with something less certain. A waiting, a watching. Inspector Purbright took a slow, deliberate walk toward the town's modest market square, his trench coat collar turned up against the damp chill. The day's agenda was to widen his inquiries, to listen more deeply to the murmurs that flitted through the town's parlours and pubs, to meet new faces whose grudges and alliances might illuminate the deeper currents beneath the ritual's surface. His first stop was the Blue Boar, Flaxborough's long-standing public house, a timbered building redolent of spilled ale and stories passed between generations. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the low hum of conversation. Purbright settled into a corner seat, his presence unobtrusive as he scanned the room. Behind the bar stood Mr. Barker, the landlord, polishing glasses with an efficiency born of years in the trade. A few regulars nursed pints, exchanging quiet observations. Purbright caught the eye of a man seated nearby, a Mr. Simmons, a local grocer known for his sharp wit and keener ear. "Mr. Simmons," Purbright began smoothly, "might I trouble you for your thoughts on the recent happenings? The flower show, Mr. Wilkes, and all that followed?" Simmons smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Ah, Inspector, Flaxborough thrives on its secrets and scandals, but between you and me there's been talk of old debts and fresh resentments bubbling under the surface." Purbright encouraged the thread. "Old debts?" "Indeed. Town council disputes, rivalry between the florists, and the ever-present tension between tradition and progress. Mr. Wilkes stirred the pot by dabbling in things best left alone." A pause, then Simmons lowered his voice. "Some say he upset certain influential folk, people who don't take kindly to being reminded of the past." Purbright's mind took note. Influence, resentment, grudges, familiar ingredients in the town's social stew. Before Simmons could elaborate, the door swung open, admitting a gust of damp air and a figure Purbright recognized. Miss Langley, flushed from her brisk walk. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "I've just spoken with Mrs. Henshaw again. She mentioned a gathering last night at the old manor on Mill Lane, a clandestine meeting by all accounts." Purbright's interest sharpened. The old manor, long vacant, had a reputation for mysterious occupants and whispered tales. "Do you know who attended?" he asked. "Only that it included some of the town's less visible figures, people connected to the old families and their secrets." Mrs. Henshaw couldn't say more, but the mood was tense. Purbright exchanged a glance with Simmons. "Thank you both. I believe I have a new place to visit." The old manor sat at the edge of Mill Lane, its silhouette stark against the dull sky. Ivy crept over crumbling stonework, and the windows stared blankly like dark eyes. Purbright approached cautiously. mindful of the rumours surrounding the place. The heavy oak door was ajar, and from within came muffled voices. Stepping inside, the inspector found a small group gathered around a low table cluttered with papers and flickering candles. The room smelled of damp wood and aged leather. At the centre was Mr. Grayson, the retired bank clerk, who greeted Purbright with a nod. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you're just in time. We were discussing the implications of Mr. Wilkes's actions and the wider threat to Flaxborough's heritage." Purbright scanned the others. Mrs. Whitmore, her expression stern and composed, a Mr. Alder, the local historian, and a woman whose face was half hidden beneath a lace shawl, her eyes bright with intensity. "May I ask," Purbright began, "what has brought you together?" Mr. Alder spoke first. "We are the Keepers, a society dedicated to preserving Flaxborough's history and traditions, including the old rites Mr. Wilkes has been exploring." Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "But there is division among us. Some see these rituals as vital, others as dangerous relics." The woman in the shawl, who introduced herself as Miss Devlin, added, "The recent disruptions threaten not just our customs, but the very fabric of the community. We fear the balance is unravelling." Purbright listened, noting the undercurrents of fear and determination. The Keepers were real, a shadow society operating quietly beneath the town's polite surface. "Where does the scarred man fit into this?" Purbright asked. A hush fell. Mr. Grayson exchanged a glance with Miss Devlin. "He is a guardian, but also a warning," she said. "He represents the cost of vigilance, the sacrifices required to protect Flaxborough." Purbright considered this. "And Mr. Wilkes?" "An earnest but inexperienced scholar," Mr. Alder said. "He sought to understand the past, but has stirred forces beyond his control." The meeting ended with cautious agreement. The inspector would be kept informed, but discretion was paramount. Leaving the manor, Purbright felt the weight of the town's history pressing upon him. Flaxborough was a place where the past and present collided quietly but forcefully, where the veneer of civility masked intricate webs of loyalty and fear. That evening, back at the station, Purbright reviewed his notes. The ritual in room 17 was no longer an isolated oddity, but the focal point of a complex tapestry: old societies, divided loyalties, and the fragile balance of a town clinging to its identity. The game was deepening, and Purbright knew that the next steps required careful navigation between the visible and the hidden, between truth and the stories people told themselves. As he prepared to leave, Sergeant Carrow approached. "Inspector, you might want to speak with Miss Langley again. She's been receiving some curious letters, anonymous, warning her to keep out of certain affairs." Purbright nodded, the familiar pattern of threat and secrecy closing in. In Flaxborough, the past was never truly past. The late afternoon sun was already dipping low when Inspector Purbright made his way to the small cottage at the edge of Flaxborough's western lane where Miss Langley lived. The damp chill had given way to a sharper, crisper air, and the soft rustle of autumn leaves accompanied his steps. His mind replayed the mounting layers of the mystery, the secret society, the scarred stranger, the old rituals that seemed to bind the town in an uneasy pact. Miss Langley opened the door before he had a chance to knock, her face pale but resolute. "Inspector," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you for coming." Her sitting room was neat and unpretentious, with a scattering of flower-arranging books and pressed petals under glass. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air, as if the room itself held its breath. "Tell me about these letters," Purbright began. She nodded, motioning him to a small wooden table where a few folded sheets lay. "They started arriving about a week ago," she explained. "At first, just a single note, unsigned, warning me to stay away from certain matters. Then more letters followed, each more urgent, some even threatening. Purbright unfolded one carefully. The handwriting was hurried but legible. "Miss Langley, your curiosity endangers you and those around you. Cease your inquiries into the rituals and the keepers, or face consequences. Flaxborough's peace depends on silence." "Have you any idea who might have sent them?" he asked. She shook her head. "I can only think it might be someone involved with the keepers, though I can't be sure." The inspector leaned back, considering. Threats and warnings were seldom idle in this town. They spoke of fear, of secrets meant to be buried. "Has anyone else mentioned similar letters or warnings?" "Not that I know. But after last night's meeting at the manor, I'm more cautious than ever." Purbright's thoughts turned to the meeting, the divisions among the keepers, the fragile alliances. It was clear that the ritual was more than a quaint tradition. It was a battleground for control over the town's future. As they spoke, a faint knock sounded at the door. Miss Langley's eyes narrowed. "That might be someone I wasn't expecting." Purbright rose, moving to answer. Outside stood Mrs. Penfold, clutching her handbag tightly, her expression anxious. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "I heard from Mrs. Henshaw that there's been another incident at the old mill." Purbright's pulse quickened. The mill had already been a focal point of strange occurrences. "What sort of incident?" he asked. "Last night, some of the town's night watch reported seeing figures moving about, and there was the sound of raised voices and glass breaking." "Anything more specific?" "No, but they feared trouble. Some think it's connected to the rituals and the secret meetings." Purbright thanked her and turned to Miss Langley. "I'll need to visit the mill again." The inspector and Miss Langley set out together, their footsteps echoing in the damp twilight. The mill loomed ahead, dark and silent, save for the occasional creak of old timbers. As they approached, Purbright spotted Sergeant Carrow, already on the scene. "Inspector," Carrow greeted, "we found this near the broken window." He held up a small, crumpled scrap of parchment, stained and worn. Purbright unfolded it carefully. The text was cryptic, written in an ornate script. "Beware the outsider who seeks the lost knowledge. The scarred one guards what should remain hidden. The ritual must not be disturbed again." Purbright's brow furrowed. The message echoed the earlier letter found in the mill's wall, reinforcing the presence of a vigilant faction determined to protect the town's secrets. "Who else knows about this?" Purbright asked Carrow. "Only those involved in the investigation, sir. We've kept it quiet." Purbright nodded, then turned to Miss Langley. "We must find out who is sending these warnings and why." Their investigation led them back into the town's quieter corners, to people whose lives brushed against the edge of Flaxborough's hidden past. At the bakery, Mrs. Murdoch spoke in hushed tones about the old families and the rivalries that still simmered beneath polite smiles. In the butcher's shop, Mr. Pritchard hinted at debts owed and loyalties tested. Each conversation added layers to the portrait of a town both bound and divided by its secrets. Later that evening, Purbright returned to the police station, where the scarred man had been tentatively identified. The records were sparse, but the name Elias Morven surfaced, an enigmatic figure with ties to obscure antiquarian societies and a history of living on the fringes of towns like Flaxborough. Morven was reportedly a scholar of old rites, but also rumoured to be involved in less reputable dealings, his scar said to be the legacy of a quarrel long past. Purbright mused on the intersection of knowledge and shadow, how the pursuit of history could sometimes lead into darker corridors. As night deepened, the inspector sat alone, reviewing his notes and the letters threatening Miss Langley. The balance in Flaxborough was delicate, held by threads of loyalty, fear, and the weight of the past. The ritual in room 17 had begun to unravel not only secrets, but the very fabric of the town's quiet order. Tomorrow would demand still more careful probing. The dawn was slow to break over Flaxborough, the town wrapped in a pale, misty light that blurred edges and softened shadows. Inspector Purbright, as was his habit, arrived at the police station before the morning bustle began. His mind, restless with the threads of the investigation, was already turning over the fresh details of Elias Morven, the scarred stranger now moving from shadow to substance. Morven's past was elusive, the kind of figure who appeared intermittently in dusty records or whispered conversation, always on the margins of respectable society, a scholar, yes, but also a man whose affiliations and motives remained tangled. It was a duality Purbright understood well, knowledge wielded as both shield and weapon. At the station, Sergeant Carow awaited him with news. "We've been able to trace some correspondence linked to Morven," Carow said, handing over a bundle of letters and notes. "Mostly cryptic, but they suggest a network of others like him, concerned with preserving certain traditions." Purbright examined the papers carefully. The writing was ornate, laden with symbolism and veiled references to keepers, wards, and the sanctity of the ritual. It seemed the circle protecting Flaxborough's secrets was larger than anyone had guessed. "There's mention here of the Covenant of the Veil," Carow continued. "A group that claims guardianship over ancient rites. Morven appears to be a member, or at least closely connected." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "This aligns with the keepers we encountered at the manor." The inspector spent the morning piecing together what little he could from the letters, each one a puzzle fragment hinting at an older, more intricate web beneath Flaxborough's polite surface. By midday, he was on his way to the library to confer with Miss Harcourt, whose expertise in local history had already proved invaluable. The librarian greeted him with a knowing smile. "I've been researching the Covenant of the Veil," she said. "It's an obscure society dating back centuries, dedicated to safeguarding rituals and knowledge deemed too dangerous for common awareness." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "And their activities in Flaxborough?" Miss Harcourt glanced toward the dusty shelves. "They've been quietly active here for generations. Their members include townsfolk who trace their lineage to founding families. The rituals are intended as protection, but some fear they verge on fanaticism. Do you know if Mr. Wilkes or Morven have ever been formally involved?" Wilkes was more a student of the tradition, an outsider fascinated by the law. Morven is different, a recognized keeper, though his methods are considered unorthodox, even by his peers. Purbright made a note of this. The distinction between scholar and zealot was crucial. Later that afternoon, Purbright arranged to meet with Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Alder at the town hall to discuss the implications. The councilwoman's expression was guarded but resolute. "We cannot allow these secret societies to dictate the town's future," she said firmly. "Flaxborough must move forward, not be shackled by superstition." Mr. Alder, however, took a more measured tone. "The past is part of us, whether we acknowledge it or not. These rituals have in some ways preserved the town's character, but I agree that transparency is needed." Purbright sensed the underlying tensions between progress and preservation, secrecy and openness that defined the town's fault lines. The conversation was interrupted by a message delivered by Sergeant Carow. A visitor awaited the inspector downstairs. Descending to the reception area, Purbright found himself face to face with Elias Morven. The man was striking in his ruggedness, a scar slicing down one cheek, eyes sharp and assessing, his presence both imposing and enigmatic. "Inspector Purbright," Morven began, his voice low and deliberate, "I believe it is time we spoke frankly." Purbright gestured toward the waiting room. "By all means, Mr. Morven." As they settled into the quiet space, Morven outlined his perspective. "The rituals are not mere superstition," he said. "They are a safeguard against forces that have shaped this town's history in ways most do not understand. My role is to protect that legacy to ensure it endures." Purbright listened, noting the conviction beneath the words. "But what of Mr. Wilkes?" he asked. "He appears caught between scholarship and involvement." Morven's gaze flickered. "Wilkes sought knowledge, but without respect for the boundaries. That is dangerous. The ritual at the flower show was a test, one that unfortunately disturbed those boundaries." "Disturbed enough to cause the break-in at the mill?" Purbright pressed. Morven hesitated. "There are those who believe the balance must be restored at any cost. The letter you found was a warning, not just to outsiders, but to those within who would stray." The inspector leaned forward. "And the scar? What is its significance?" "A mark of one who has faced the consequences of guarding the veil," Morven replied. "A reminder that vigilance has its price." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Carrow, bearing news of a further incident. Another gathering, this time in the woods near the quarry, observed by a group of townsfolk who reported strange lights and chanting. Purbright's mind sharpened. "The situation is escalating," he said quietly. "We must find a way to bring this to light before it spirals further." Morven nodded. "The keepers do not seek conflict, but they will defend their charge." As evening fell, Purbright walked back through Flaxborough's streets, the mist rising again to cloak the town in its familiar shroud. The ritual was no longer a secret whispered in one room. It was a force awakening, pulling at the town's fragile peace. The inspector's task had become clearer and more perilous. The night wrapped Flaxborough in a velvet cloak, muffling sounds and casting long shadows through its narrow lanes. Inspector Purbright stood near the threshold of the old quarry, the air crisp and still, except for the distant hoot of an owl and the faint rustling of dry leaves. His thoughts churned over the recent revelations, the covenant of the veil, the secret keepers, Elias Morven's wary words, and the growing unrest, threading through the town. This was the moment he had been awaiting, the quiet test that might draw the tangled web into the light. Purbright's plan was simple, yet delicate, a staged encounter designed to unsettle the parties involved and provoke a response revealing hidden motives. He had invited Morven to meet him here under the guise of discussing terms for cooperation, hoping the scarred man's composure would slip when confronted with the full measure of the investigation. As he waited, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A solitary figure emerged from the shadows, Morven, his scarred face grim but unreadable. "Inspector," Morven greeted, his voice low and steady. "You chose a fitting place for our discussion." "Indeed," Purbright replied calmly. "Seclusion for candor." They settled near the quarry's edge, the moonlight casting pale illumination on weathered stones and tangled roots. "Mr. Morven," Purbright began, "the letters, the rituals, the meetings, all are pieces of a puzzle. But one piece remains unclear, the involvement of certain townsfolk who might exploit these secrets for personal gain." Morven's gaze flickered, but he said nothing. Purbright continued, "You have guardianship over these rites, but there are those who see opportunity in fear and tradition, using the keepers as a shield." Morven's jaw tightened. "There are always factions, Inspector. Some seek to protect, others to manipulate." Purbright nodded slowly. "Then tell me, who among the keepers do you trust? Who might have the most to gain from stirring unrest? Morven's eyes narrowed. That is a question you must answer for yourself. Before Purbright could press further, footsteps approached from the opposite side of the quarry. A woman emerged, Miss Devlin, her presence as enigmatic as ever, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Inspector," she said softly, "I hope I'm not intruding." Purbright gestured to her to join them. "Not at all, Miss Devlin. Your timing is impeccable." She took a seat, folding her hands neatly. "There is much at stake," she said. "The keepers are divided. Some advocate transparency, others secrecy. The recent events have inflamed passions that were better left dormant." Purbright looked between the two. "Do you believe the ritual was disrupted intentionally, or was it the result of inexperience?" Miss Devlin hesitated. "Both, perhaps. Wilkes's curiosity, combined with outside pressures, has threatened the balance, but darker forces are at play." "Darker forces?" Purbright pressed. She glanced toward Morven, who met her look with unspoken understanding. "There are those who would harness the old powers for personal ambition," she said. "Not all who claim guardianship are trustworthy." Purbright's mind raced. This was more than a simple dispute over tradition. It was a battle for influence cloaked in ancient rites. Suddenly, a sound shattered the stillness. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. All three turned toward the noise, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons or torches. From the darkness emerged a group of figures, faces obscured, voices low but urgent. The keepers, or a faction thereof, had gathered, their presence both a threat and a challenge. Purbright stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We need not resort to hostility," he said evenly. "The truth will come out, but only if we proceed with openness and respect." A tall man, cloaked and hooded, stepped forward, voice gravelly. "You meddle in matters beyond your understanding, Inspector. The rituals bind this town, disturb them, and chaos follows." Morven's scarred face hardened. "And yet, this chaos is what we fear most. Secrets have blinded us to the risks of division." Purbright addressed the assembly. "I propose a council, representatives from all sides, to discuss the future openly. Flaxborough deserves no less." There was murmuring among the group, tension palpable. After a long moment, the hooded man inclined his head. "Very well, but know this, the keepers watch closely. Betrayal will be met with swift consequence." As the crowd dispersed into the night, Purbright felt the fragile threads of trust stretch taut but unbroken. Returning to his quarters, he considered the delicate balance ahead. The ritual in room 17 had become a catalyst, exposing fears, ambitions, and the complex interplay of past and present. His test had begun, but the outcome was far from certain. The morning sun filtered weakly through heavy clouds as Flaxborough slowly roused from its uneasy slumber. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk in the quiet police station, the faint aroma of cold tea mingling with the rustle of papers. The events of the previous night, the confrontation at the quarry, the fragile agreement to convene a council, weighed heavily on his mind. He understood that the next steps required the utmost care. In a town where old grudges and whispered secrets ran deep, truth was often the most delicate matter of all. As he sipped his tea, Sergeant Carrow entered, bearing a parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. "Inspector, this was delivered early this morning, addressed to you." Purbright took the parcel and carefully unwrapped it. Inside lay a small, intricately carved wooden box. Its surface was etched with symbols reminiscent of those in the ritual book from room 17. He lifted the lid cautiously, revealing a folded piece of parchment. Unfolding the parchment, Purbright read, "For the seeker of truth, beware the line between revelation and ruin. The past watches, and the future depends on your wisdom." A subtle but unmistakable message. Someone close to the secrets was sending a warning or perhaps a test. Before Purbright could reflect further, the telephone rang, its sharp chime breaking the silence. He answered promptly. Inspector Purbright speaking. "Inspector, it's Mrs. Whitmore," came the voice, brisk and controlled. "We have received disturbing news. Another member of the keepers, Mr. Aldridge, was found unconscious near the riverbank this morning. No signs of robbery or assault, but he's in a bad state." Purbright's brow furrowed. "Do you know what happened?" "Not yet. The doctors suspect poisoning, but we're awaiting confirmation. Mr. Aldridge was outspoken in his criticism of the secretive factions within the town." Purbright felt the weight of the situation deepen. The political tensions, once confined to whispered conversations, were manifesting in violence. "I will come at once," he said. Arriving at the modest riverside cottage where Aldridge was convalescing, Purbright found the man pale and weak, yet lucid. Mrs. Whitmore stood nearby, her usual composure strained. "Inspector," Aldridge murmured, "there are forces in this town that will not tolerate exposure." "I feared this would happen." Purbright studied the man carefully. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" Aldridge shook his head slightly. "Too many have motives. The keepers are fractured. Some cling to secrecy, others seek control. The poison was a message." Purbright nodded gravely. "We will find out who sent it." Leaving the cottage, the inspector's thoughts returned to the wooden box and its message. The delicate balance of power was tipping, and Flaxborough's genteel facade was cracking under pressure. Later that afternoon, Purbright convened the hastily assembled council promised the night before. Representatives from the keepers, the town council, and notable townsfolk gathered in the town hall's chamber, the atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken suspicion. Purbright opened the meeting with his characteristic calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, Flaxborough stands at a crossroads. The recent events have revealed fault lines that can no longer be ignored. Our purpose today is to find a path forward, one that honors the past but protects the future." Mrs. Whitmore spoke next, her tone firm. "Transparency is essential. The town deserves to understand the nature of these rituals and the role they play." Mr. Alder, the historian, nodded. "But we must also ensure that knowledge is shared responsibly. Some secrets, while ancient, bear consequences if mishandled." Miss Devlin added softly, "There are those who would exploit fear for personal gain. We must be vigilant." The discussion unfolded carefully, each participant voicing concerns and aspirations. At times, voices rose in disagreement, but Purbright's steady presence tempered the tensions. Toward the meeting's end, Purbright posed a question designed to test honesty and intent. "Who among us has sought to use these rituals not for preservation, but for power?" A heavy silence fell. Then, slowly, a hand rose. "Mr. Grayson, the retired bank clerk." "I confess," Grayson said quietly. "I have urged caution, yes, but also action. The balance has been disturbed, and I feared inaction would harm us all." Purbright looked at him closely. "And have you taken steps beyond counsel?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "I have, but only to protect the town as I understand it." The inspector's gaze swept the room. The complexities were real. Loyalty, fear, ambition intertwined in the dance. As the meeting adjourned, Purbright reflected on the shifting alliances and the fragile hope for resolution. Returning to his office, he found another letter waiting, unsigned and stark. "The ritual's truth lies not in secrecy, but in courage. Choose wisely." Purbright folded the letter, a faint smile touching his lips. The game was nearing its climax. The chamber was hushed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the chill evening air. A circle of chairs had been arranged in the town hall's old meeting room, room 17 once more, where the ritual had first been performed and the mystery had quietly ignited. Tonight, the town's key players had gathered, summoned by Inspector Purbright's invitation to finally untangle the threads that had bound Flaxborough in suspicion and silence. Purbright stood at the centre, a small stack of notes in hand, his usual mild demeanour tempered by the gravity of the occasion. Around him sat Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Alder, Miss Devlin, Mr. Grayson, Elias Morven, Miss Langley, Sergeant Carrow, and a few others whose names and motives had become clearer through the weeks of investigation. "Thank you all for coming," Purbright began, his voice measured and calm. "Flaxborough is a town proud of its traditions, yet those traditions must not be allowed to cloud our judgment or divide us. The recent incidents, the ritual, the letters, the threats, even the poisoning, are symptoms of deeper tensions. Tonight, I hope to bring those to light." A murmur passed through the room, but Purbright raised a hand to still it. The ritual in room 17 was intended as a symbol, a reaffirmation of the town's heritage and the delicate balance between past and present. But it was disrupted by curiosity, fear, and, I suspect, ambition. He turned his gaze toward Mr. Grayson, who met it steadily. "Mr. Grayson, you admitted to taking steps beyond counsel to protect the town. Would you care to explain?" Grayson took a breath. "I feared the ritual's disruption would unravel what little control we had left. I acted to prevent chaos, but I see now my methods may have sown discord." Purbright nodded. "Your intentions were protective, but the poison administered to Mr. Aldridge suggests darker tactics at play." Grayson's face paled. "I did not poison anyone. That was not my doing." The inspector shifted his attention to Elias Morven. "Mr. Morven, as a keeper and guardian, what role did you play?" Morven's scarred visage was inscrutable. "I sought to guide Mr. Wilkes and others away from reckless actions. The rituals are not mere ceremonies, they are safeguards. Yet the divisions within the keepers themselves have made our task more difficult." Miss Devlin added softly, "There are those among us who would exploit the rituals for personal gain. Fear and secrecy can breed dangerous ambitions." Purbright allowed a pause before addressing the group as a whole. "Flaxborough's troubles are not the result of one person's actions, but of a collective failure to communicate and trust. The letters, the threats, the unrest, they stem from fear of change and loss of control." He looked to Miss Langley. "Your inquiries brought many truths to light, and your courage in facing threats is commendable." Miss Langley inclined her head, her usual quiet strength evident. "Inspector, what now?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Now we move forward. The rituals will continue, but openly and with community involvement. Secrets have no place where trust must grow." Mrs. Whitmore nodded approvingly. A new chapter for Flaxborough. As the meeting concluded, a sense of relief and tentative hope settled over the room. The town's delicate balance was being restored, not by concealment, but by understanding. Later, as the guests departed into the crisp night, Purbright lingered in the empty room, reflecting on the journey from a simple flower show to a complex tale of tradition, fear, and human frailty. He pulled a chair to the window and watched the street lamps flicker on, casting pools of light on the cobbles. The ritual in room 17 had revealed much about the town, its people, and the quiet power of history. And Inspector Purbright, with his patient and probing nature, had gently pulled the shadows aside.